My full name is Matthew John George O Sullivan. The George I don't really acknowledge, and I scarcely acknowledge the John, but there they are. I was born in Auckland in New Zealand on the 18th of March 1942, which I'm sure you'll remember, well, you won't remember, but you'll recall from reading your history, was a pretty dark time in the world's history. The Japanese were advancing. They hadn't quite reached New Zealand, but they were getting frighteningly close. And I arrived. Mind you, I was unaware of all this. I didn't take much notice of the war, to be quite honest. I let other people do the fighting. It was somewhat disruptive. I wouldn't say it was an unhappy childhood particularly, but because my mother was not married when she had me, which at that time was something of a stain on one's character, I was adopted to the O Sullivan family, and they took me under their wing. I can't remember at what age that happened. I must have been very young. I just have no idea. So I grew up with them in a suburb called Eastbourne, which is on the other side of the harbour from Wellington in New Zealand. And that was fine. That was fine. They were a lovely family, and I didn't know I was adopted. I had no inkling of that. I didn't learn about that until much later. So I was not an only child because they had one son who was about 5 or 6 years older than me. There was a sort of conspiracy of silence. You see, I had an aunt who visited regularly and sent me birthday presents and Christmas presents and took a great interest in everything, who was in fact my mother, but I didn't know that until I was 14, was when she told me that she was actually my parent, which came as something as a surprise, I must say. I have no knowledge of my adoptive father because he died, I think, either before I arrived on the scene or very soon afterwards. I have no memory of him at all. And my adopted mother died when I was, how old would I have been? Around about 12 when she died. And I was about a little older when my adoptive brother died. He was only 24 when he died. So I was suddenly bereft. And so at that stage I was sent to boarding school in Christchurch in the South Island. And my new home in between being at boarding school was with my aunt, as I assumed she was. So that was quite a sort of shattering and very life-changing event when all that happened, because the deaths of my mother and brother were really quite close together. Well, my adoptive brother Harvey, and whom I named my own son after, I think would have been the strongest influence in my life, sort of at that stage. He was very much a role model. I mean, I was in awe of the fact that he was a policeman, you know, and a plain-clothes policeman. And one day he came home and he showed me his revolver. I wasn't even allowed to touch it, but he showed it to me. I can't imagine what he was doing with a revolver, because New Zealand police, even today, are not armed. So he must have been on some special job. He was also a very keen sailor and tramper, as they call it in New Zealand. What would you call it in Australia? A hiker or climber or whatever. So I used to sometimes, if I was very good, I would go sailing with him because he was a member of what was called the Herretonga Sailing Club in Eastbourne. And that was always a huge thrill to go out on the harbour. I used to love that. So yeah, he would have been my biggest influence. I went to the local Catholic primary school, which was called San Antonio Primary School. And I can remember, I have vague memories of my first year there. And then, I seem to remember that it burnt down. I don't know. But anyway, I was homeschooled for a year or so. And I think it was because the school, and then I spent some time at the local state primary school. And then we moved from Eastbourne. We moved to a place called Titahi Bay, which is about 20 or 30 miles north of Wellington. And I went, because there was no Catholic school at that stage, I went to the Titahi Bay State School. And then I was found a place in another primary school where I had to travel by bus, which was the Catholic school. And that was run by a group of frankly rather unpleasant nuns. Well, that's my record. I didn't enjoy that at all. I was left-handed, and they were determined that I would write right-handed. And the best way of teaching me was to crack you over the knuckles with the edge of a ruler. Cunning stuff. But they never got me to write with my right hand. I just couldn't. I left school when I was 16. It was a snap decision. I'd failed my university entrance. I went home for the Christmas holidays. And then, quite by accident, I saw an ad in our local paper, the Nelson Evening Mail, for a cadet reporter. And so my mother said, well, why don't you apply for that? So I applied and I got the job. Perhaps I was the only applicant, I don't know. Anyway, I got the job as a cadet reporter. So the decision was made. I would not go back to school and I would enter the workforce. So I became a cadet reporter on the Nelson Evening Mail, which was Nelson's daily and indeed only newspaper. And so I was there, I think, for the next 3 or 4 years on the paper. I started in the reading room, which was deathly dull, proofreading, I did about 6 months in the reading room and then graduated to the reporter's room and sort of actually got on to proper reporting, which I enjoyed, but was not terribly good at because I was not really aggressive enough and insensitive enough. And you have to have some of that to be a good reporter because you've got to ask hard questions sometimes. Yeah, my first day in the reporter's room, the chief reporter called me up and said, I want you to go up to the botanical gardens and count the ducks. He said, it's duck season, the ducks will all be coming in, we want to see how many there are. Oh, okay, I said, yeah, fine. So I trotted up to the botanical gardens and spent an hour or so trying to count the ducks. I think there are quite a lot of ducks. It was quite difficult to count them because they wouldn't keep still. So I went back and said, there were 53 ducks or 123 ducks or whatever. And I couldn't quite work out why the entire reporter's room was falling about laughing. And that was my initiation ceremony. Everyone was sent out to... But I just assumed it was a real assignment. I was very young. Well, I'd done a couple of plays at secondary school, one of which was Dr. Faustus, which was very ambitious of us to mount a Marlowe play, in which I played the bad angel. But when I joined the Nelson Evening Mail, at much the same time I joined the Nelson Repertory Theatre. We were a thriving amateur group, and they had their own very beautiful theatre, which still exists. And so I started doing plays with them and one or two other groups around the place. And I sensed that I was sort of quite good at it, and that I got an enormous amount of pleasure out of it. And I thought, is there any way you could make a living out of this? But in New Zealand at that stage, no. The following year, I'd already taken the great decision to go to the UK to see if I could, in fact, get a toehold in the professional theatre. So I had that year of radio training, which is good, and I'd done by that stage, I don't know, a dozen or so plays. So I decided that the UK would be absolutely panting to have me. I arrived in February 1965, freezing cold, bitterly cold winter, and just sort of got to London, found somewhere to stay for a couple of nights, and started writing letters. I just wrote to every repertory theatre in England, I think, and Scotland and Wales, and started doing the round of the theatrical agencies, sort of found out who they were and just sort of went and knocked on the door and naively asked if they could find me some work, please. And the extraordinary thing is that within 3 weeks of arriving, it'd be about 3 weeks, I got a job. I'd auditioned for a children's theatre company, and they said, well, yeah, lovely, but we haven't got anything for you at the moment. But then I suddenly got a call because an actor had dropped out. We toured all over the UK. It was grindingly hard work, 20 performances a week, 4 a day, in different schools, moving all the time. And I was the driver of the van because I was the only one who had a driving license. But the director of the company, who's a man called Brian Way, was very good to me. And then he virtually lined up a job for me at the Victoria Theatre in Stoke-on-Trent, simply because he knew the director. And so he recommended me to him. So I went up there to do a production of Macbeth. And from there, I just started jumping around the various repertory theatres. I worked a lot in Scotland and Sheffield, all over, and plus a couple of shows in London. Then I auditioned for the Royal Shakespeare Company and got into that and spent a season at Stratford in 1967. So I was extremely fortunate. In the nearly 5 years I spent in the UK, I had 3 months out of work, in which I did house cleaning. I went back to New Zealand, I think it was 1969, somewhere. And fortuitously, in the interim, professional theatre had really started to get a hold in New Zealand. I was, by this stage, getting much more interested in directing. I held auditions for Richard III, and this girl turned up to audition for the part of Lady Anne. And I thought, A, she was very beautiful, and B, she was very good. So I cast her as Lady Anne. And gradually, during the course of the production. We became an item, and no, it wasn't very long after that we actually got married. Well, her talent, obviously, because I think she's a very fine poet. Perhaps not nearly as famous as she should be, but then although she works very hard at it, she's not particularly interested in making the right career moves, It's just a matter of doing the work and making it good. But I know, for example, she had a long friendship with Les Murray, and Les became quite a good friend of ours. And I know that he admired her work very much. And as he was one of the finest poets in the world, you can't ask for more than that. Yes, her work ethic, which is much greater than mine. I mean, you can't do nearly 100 plays in the theatre without sort of working a bit at it. You've got to learn the lines and make a bit of an effort. But I don't have the powers of concentration that she has. I don't. And we'd been married, about 12 or 14 years before the subject of children came up. And by this stage I was, 40? Yeah, 40, 41. And I sort of rather pathetically said, I'm too old to have children. But anyway, we did. So Harvey was our firstborn, and then almost immediately, a year later, we had Alexandra. So we were quite clever to have one of each, but we didn't want a third. I thought that was really going too far. So yes, 2 children who are now in their mid-30s, long since gone from home and have their own lives. And we all get on very well. My son lives in Sydney, and my daughter lives just down the road from us here in Seaford, and she has a 9-year-old son that we see a lot of and mind a lot. So that's all fine.
What do you admire about your children, Matthew?
I admire the fact that they've both found what they want to do in life, which for a period when they left secondary school, not so much Alex, but Harvey worried us a lot because he didn't seem to have an ambition or a focus, and he went and worked in Woolworths, and I thought, oh, come on. But then after a year or two, I can't remember how long, he went to TAFE and did a course in audio engineering. Now, he'd always been interested in audio, and he was part of a band, and they played gigs around the place, and that was all fine. So he did the audio thing, and then was very lucky to get a job with Studio 301 up in Sydney, which is, a leading audio place, where he still works. So he fell on his feet with that, which was virtually his first job, to walk into a top studio. And he specialises in mastering music CDs. Alex always knew what she wanted to do, which was to work with horses. The moment she left school, she went straight into a racing stables. We'd actually arranged for her work experience when she was still at college, for her to go and work at Gay Waterhouse's racing stables up in Sydney, because I knew Gay from her time when she was an actress, before she became a famous racehorse owner. And we'd been in a play together called Crown Matrimonial, which had toured all over Australia. And so I got in touch with Gay and said, could you have my daughter? And she very kindly allowed her to go and get work experience there, so that was great. So Alex then ended up becoming a jockey, and she worked as a jockey for several years, and she was having a lot of success and winning races, but then she had a series of unfortunate accidents and simply had to give up work as a jockey. So she still works with horses, she trains and she teaches riding, and she still has that connection. But now, I guess you could say the thrust of her work is she's become, like her mother, a writer, and she writes particularly on women's and feminist issues for all sorts of magazines. And she went to university and did I don't know what they call it when you work from home to go for a degree, but whatever it is, and got her BA. So I'm really ridiculously proud of both of them. Yes, I do, and I wish I didn't. Because regrets are futile. What is done is done. The past is the past. But I suppose everyone in the world thinks, if I had my time again, I would do this and I would do that. Yeah, okay. I do regret not, when I had the opportunity, not training as a film director. I could have, I think, gone to the film and television school up in Sydney. Well, I may not have got in, but assuming I had, I'd love to have done the directing course there and then had a career, hopefully, perhaps as a television director, drama director, with acting as something you might have done occasionally. But at the time when I could have done that, or should have done that, I was getting so much acting work up in Sydney and so much voiceover work, I sort of thought, I can't spare the time. Now, whether that taking my career in that direction would have worked out, of course, we'll never know. But if it had worked, it would have been brilliant, because if you're getting directing work and in your downtime or between jobs you're getting voiceover work, that would be not a bad sort of career. But I stuck to the acting and voiceovers, and that was working equally well, I suppose. So there we go. And it's only now in my dotage that I've reconnected with film, in terms of writing for it or directing for it, with doing a series of short films, which is giving me great satisfaction and which is great fun. So that's coming full circle. And I thought, I liked this old character that I'd created. Another story about him. So I wrote another story and then another story. I wrote, I think, 4 or 5. And then just on a whim, I sent them to Radio New Zealand. And they said, yes, we like these stories, we'll buy them. I don't think in terms of greatest achievements, but I suppose having a tolerably successful career as an actor when I'm temperamentally not in the least suited to it. Even before all this stage fright nonsense, when I did actively enjoy acting and enjoyed getting on stage and all that, I never felt I was temperamentally what an actor should be. It's really very hard to explain, which is why I think when we were talking about regrets, I regret the direct. I mean, I may not have made a good film director, I don't know, but I think I would have been temperamentally more suited to it than being an actor. An actor has to be, and I was very lucky because I was hardly ever out of work. But I think it was in spite of my temperament rather than because of it. Because successful actors, and I've worked with many, highly successful actors, indeed famous actors, and they do have things in common, and that is a steely resolve. People like, I can't think of his name, doesn't matter. And they have a focus that I never had. And also a certain degree of ruthlessness, which I do not have. I've never been good at networking, at moving round the foyer from director to agent to producer and making myself agreeable and doing all those things and a lot of actors are like that. They're not good at that, and they still have careers. But one wonders what one's career would have been if you were very good at that. I don't know. So I think it's an achievement to have spent 50-odd years simply doing that, in spite rather than because of. It's the obvious answer. I think it has to be your family, your children, which was a surprise to me, because being fairly indifferent to kids up until the age of 40-ish, or just not taking any notice of them, they didn't factor. But then, and this is the experience of countless millions of people, the moment you have children, your whole view on life changes. And you suddenly think, oh, I've actually created a couple of human beings. That's really quite clever of me. And my wife, because she helped. That has to be a major achievement. It has to be above anything you achieve in your career, I think. Yeah. If I hadn't told them beforehand, and I never have, and I should, I would just tell them I love them very much. I'm sure they know this, but it should be said.